You're not in a relationship. You're not in a relationship. You're somewhere in between. And the problem with somewhere in between is that it's an incredibly effective trap, specifically because it never quite becomes uncomfortable enough to force a decision. The technical term for this space is a situationship. The psychological term for why you're still in it, 5 months later, is far more interesting than you've probably been told if Lurgazalf. If you've ever found yourself months into something you can't quite name, fully aware that it doesn't have the clarity you actually want, and somehow still there, still hoping, still finding reasons to wait just a little longer, you are not unintelligent, and you are definitely not simply making bad choices. You're describing what psychology calls a highly predictable outcome of several deeply ingrained cognitive patterns working together, none of which require you to be confused about what you deserve. Here's what almost nobody explains clearly about situationships. They don't persist because the woman in one doesn't know what she wants. They persist because knowing what you want is never the part that's hard. The hard part is the gap between that knowledge and the specific fear that sits on the other side of the conversation that would get you there. Researchers studying relationship ambiguity have found that indefinite situations like these function more like relationship purgatory than relationship previews. The absence of closure isn't peaceful, it's actively stressful, and yet that stress alone is rarely enough to create movement, because the alternative, asking for what you want and risking a definitive no, feels even more costly. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why your brain keeps choosing the discomfort it knows over the clarity it says it wants. What hope bias and the sunk cost mechanism are doing in real time, and what actually moves the needle when insight alone hasn't. Because you've probably already understood the problem for months. Understanding it isn't what's been missing. Picture this. 6 months in, and the dynamic has a rhythm. He texts consistently enough. He shows up most of the time. There have been real conversations, real laughter, a few nights that felt entirely like the beginning of something. And yet the label has never been discussed. She's brought it close to the surface a few times, and felt something stop her. He hasn't brought it up at all. Neither of them has said out loud what they both seem to quietly know is sitting there, unresolved. This is where it gets uncomfortable. That avoidance isn't passive. Both people are actively choosing ambiguity every single day. Because ambiguity serves a function. It allows her to maintain hope without risking the loss of that hope. It allows him to maintain access without the cost of commitment. And it allows both of them to avoid a conversation whose outcome genuinely cannot be controlled in advance. Research on fear of rejection in romantic contexts consistently finds that the anticipation of rejection activates the brain's threat detection system in ways almost identical to anticipating physical pain. So avoiding the defining conversation isn't twisty or rational in the way it might look from the outside. It's a nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do. Avoid an experience it has already filed as potentially dangerous. But that's only half the story. Because hope bias, the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of desired outcomes, and discount evidence that contradicts them, doesn't just make it hard to see the situationship clearly. It actively rewrites the evidence in real time. A warm evening becomes proof that he's moving toward commitment. 3 days of distance becomes a temporary anomaly, probably work stress. Researchers studying optimism bias in dating have found that people in ambiguous relationships consistently overestimate their partner's level of mutual investment, sometimes by significant margins, because the emotional cost of accurate assessment is genuinely higher than the cost of motivated optimism. Here's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Layered underneath hope bias is the sunk cost mechanism, one of the most stubborn cognitive patterns in human decision-making. The sunk cost fallacy describes the tendency to continue investing in something specifically because of how much you've already put in, independent of whether continuing makes sense going forward. In a situationship, every month that passes without definition becomes additional sunk cost, additional time, emotional energy, intimacy, and vulnerability that now has to be accounted for when calculating whether to leave. And because the mind treats past investment as evidence of future value, The longer the situationship continues without resolution, the harder it becomes to exit. Not because anything has actually improved, but simply because leaving means accepting that the investment produced nothing. Here's the deeper truth this entire video has been building toward. A situationship doesn't keep you stuck because you don't know what you want. It keeps you stuck because it was architecturally designed, by accident or otherwise, to make leaving cost more than staying, at every possible decision point. Think of it like this. Imagine a building with a very comfortable lobby but no visible stairs. You walked in because it seemed promising. You found a couch and sat down. The couch is okay, not what you were looking for, but not so bad that you're motivated to stand up and look for the stairs. Time passes. You've been sitting long enough now that getting up feels effortful in proportion to how long you're reigning. Effort med eating save. Someone occasionally brings you something pleasant, a cup of coffee, a warm conversation, a moment that feels almost like the beginning of what you came in looking for. And every time that happens, you think, maybe this is it. Maybe now the stairs will appear. This is why simply knowing you deserve more doesn't get you off the couch. The couch isn't keeping you there because it's comfortable enough. It's keeping you there because the cost of standing up has been quietly compounding while you'd been sitting. This is also why anxiety researchers describe the chronic low-grade vigilance of not knowing, where you stand in a relationship, as often more psychologically taxing than a clean ending, because a clean ending allows grief to complete, while permanent ambiguity keeps grief perpetually on hold, renewed just often enough by small positive signals to prevent resolution. This is what's actually happening every time you almost have the defining conversation and then don't. You're not failing to be brave. You're accurately calculating, often unconsciously, that the risk of a definitive no feels more immediately costly than the ongoing discomfort of not knowing, even though the ongoing discomfort is actually the larger long-term cost. And here's the part that should genuinely change how you see this. The situationship's power depends entirely on the conversation never happening. That's not a coincidence. That's the mechanism. The moment the question gets asked out loud, the ambiguity collapses, one way or another. And a collapsed ambiguity, even a painful one, is always more workable than an open loop you're quietly building your emotional life around. So how do you actually get off the couch? Here's what genuinely helps. First, stop waiting for a moment that feels right, and start recognizing that the discomfort of the conversation is the price of the information, not an obstacle to it. There is no version of the defining conversation that doesn't feel slightly vulnerable. The goal isn't to wait until it feels easy. The goal is to understand that the discomfort you feel at the thought of having it is structurally identical to the discomfort you've already been living with for months, except that one of those discomforts produces information, and the other simply continues. Second, audit the hope you're re-carrying against actual behavioral evidence, rather than individual moments. Write down what he consistently does over the full span of time you've known each other. Not what happened on the best night, not what he said when things were good, but what the actual behavioral average looks like across ordinary weeks. Hope bias lives in the best moments. Reality lives in the average. Third, name the specific fear underneath the avoidance out loud, even just to yourself. The most common one is, if I ask and the answer is no, I'll lose both the relationship and the hope that it could become what I wanted. That's a real and painful fear. But naming it clearly separates it from the actual decision, which is whether continued ambiguity is genuinely preferable to whatever clarity might cost. Fourth, set a private deadline for yourself. Not a threat you announce to him, but a genuine internal commitment. By a specific date, you will have asked, or you will have left. Without a deadline, the situationship's default state is indefinite continuation. And indefinite is the mechanism, not an accident. Fifth, understand that a no is not the worst outcome you've been treating it as. A no ends something that wasn't giving you what you need. An ongoing undefined arrangement that might end with a no in 6 more months is the same outcome, plus 6 more months of sunk cost. Here's the empowering part of all of this. You're not stuck because you're weak or because you don't know better. You're stuck because the situationship is psychologically engineered, by the specific combination of hope, sunk cost, and fear of rejection, to feel costlier to leave than to stay at every single decision point. Once you see the engineering, you can stop fighting yourself and start dismantling the trap instead. You were never confused about what you wanted. You were afraid of the conversation that would tell you whether you could have it. Those are not the same thing, and only one of them is worth fixing. If this gave language to something you've been living but never quite had words for, tell me in the comments. Have you ever stayed in a situationship you already knew wasn't what you actually wanted? Let's talk about it down there. And if you want more breakdowns like this one, on the psychology behind why we stay in dynamics that aren't working, subscribe, because we're going to keep unpacking this together.